For the oral history collections of the Fashion Institute of Technology and for the oral history of the college itself, this will be an interview with President Marvin Feldman. The date is November 13th, 1984. The interviewer is Mildred Finger. President Feldman, before you tell us how you got to be President Feldman, supposing you start back at some very early point in your life, and let's hear about what your interests were when you were growing up, where you grew up, and so on. Okay?
All right. I was born in Rochester, New York in 1927. My family moved to Los Angeles, California in the 30s. I don't quite remember where in the 30s. And I grew up in Los Angeles, in East Los Angeles, in the community then known as Boyle Heights. And I went to school in Boyle Heights and graduated from Roosevelt High School in, I think, 43 or 44. And I joined the Navy. And I was a machinist mate, second class, on the USS Steamer Bay. And we fought in the Pacific. I left the Navy in 46, I think. Then I applied for admission to the United States Military Academy at West Point. I was admitted as a plebe in 1947 or 48. I was a cadet at the Military Academy till 1951.
What drew you to a military school?
Oh, my rage, I guess, about the Holocaust. And, didn't discover till years and years later. My father also joined the British Fusiliers with Jabotinsky and was in the fighting the Turks. He was in the British Army. I never knew about until years and years later. I never really dreamt of being a civilian. I just never thought I'd ever be a civilian as long as I can remember. And becoming a civilian was sort of being reborn again. And that occurred around 1952. And I went back to California. My family is...
that was after graduation from...
Well, I was on special assignment with the government. I was with the 82nd Airborne, and I was in something called Special Services. But then I later became a civilian. And it was sort of strange because I guess I was in my early 30s, just having been born again. It was very strange. It never entered my mind that I have to think about schooling or a career or find something to do. Of course, the family wanted me to go into the business. We were in the furniture business, and I didn't think I would be interested in that. Perhaps in hindsight, I should have. I'm the only one left working.
You never were a merchant. You never were interested in merchandising, in other words.
Oh, I did. As a child, I sold. I was a good salesman. As a matter of fact, I was very good at it. I even once in a huff went to work for Sears and Roebuck. I sold fencing and pharmacy equipment while I was still in high school. But I also was interested, as growing up in Los Angeles, one becomes interested in cars and hot rods and that sort of thing. In any event, I had a lot of GI Bill time, so I took a degree. I went to San Francisco State University. I decided to be a teacher for all those good reasons of 3 months vacation, I guess. And,
was that in Hayakawa's time?
Hayakawa was one of my teachers. He was a professor, as a matter of fact, in languages and communications. He wasn't the president then. We had other presidents. And got very much interested because of my checkered background and never realizing that the courses at the military academy were relevant to higher education. I was sort of a strange student. I had more math than math teachers were required to have. I had more science than science teachers were required to have. So I was out interning in the public schools of San Francisco as a student teacher and as a intern, and became very much interested in the capable average learner. The kids that we're now talking about in these new excellence reports, the ones in the general tracks, were neither in good academic or good vocational education. And a position opened up at a very precious institution in San Francisco called Cogswell Polytechnical College. This was an old college that was founded in 1887. It was tuition-free, as a matter of fact, tax-exempt corporation. Very low-key, had engineering technology majors in it. And I went there as a teacher of mathematics and surveying and sciences and developed programs with the secondary schools on alternative learning episodes, different ways of kids achieving academics in nonverbal ways. These were the kids who would be counseled out of academic work about the 10th grade and told not to worry about it, take speech instead of English, and take social science instead of history, and hold your math. That way, you go on to your local community college, don't worry about it.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't understand that.
Well, there are three major tracks in the public schools. At one, there's a fine academic track. These are the kids who go on to the Ivy League schools, win Nobel Prizes, and work better than anybody in the world. There's also a very good vocational system in America. These are kids who take, they're the future farmers of America, or they're distributive education clubs. And there's good vocational education in some places in our country. But there's very little for the students who are neither in good academic or good vocational. And we used to have 1 out of 4 students used to be in the general track. It's now 1 out of 2. This is the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem are not the kids achieving good vocational education or good academic education. It's the kids that are in the general schemes. And those kids interested me back then because I thought there were other ways of dealing with them if we recognized that their learning styles may not be verbal. In any event, from the base of Cogswell, which was practically a public school because it was tuition free and we had more endowment that we could use, and a good reputation in the technologies, I went into a good number of public schools designing something called the Richmond Plan and pre-tech. The literature is full of all this stuff. This went on toward the early 60s with local support from foundations, the Rosenberg Foundation, Randall Lux Foundation, a lot of San Francisco foundations. The Ford Foundation became very much interested in these activities and gave me a couple of big grants. And we were doing all sorts of experimental work with other ways of dealing with learning, where the outcomes had to be the same. In any event, they decided it was cheaper to hire me, so they hired me. We left San Francisco and I came to New York, and I worked for the Ford Foundation.
Oh, I'm sorry, before you go on, I assume by then you were married, from the way you said we came to New York.
Yes, I met my wife in San Francisco. Our children were born there, both my sons. And the dates won't give me a year either way, but there was 62, 3 or 4. We came to New York, and I worked for the Ford Foundation until 68, I think, when Nixon was first elected. One of my grantees out in California was Bob Finch, who was at one time Lieutenant Governor of California, but we were doing industry education linkages, and Bob and Lou Butler and a group of people from California were our grantees. Bob called me and told me he was going to Washington, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under Richard Nixon, which surprised me no end. He probably could have been the vice president. In any event, Bob asked me to go down to Washington with him to create some policy papers independent of the bureaucrats. And I took leave from the Ford Foundation and went down and did a number of position papers for Bob, and I wrote a couple of bills, the Comprehensive Community College Act of '68, Cooperative Education, a bunch of others. And all during that period, I was doing a tremendous amount of writing. As a matter of fact, if you have my Vita, they list them all, and I began to write quite a bit about education. While in Washington on leave, I was doing a presentation to the cabinet on, I think, community colleges, I'm not quite sure. And I met Donald Rumsfeld, Donald had been a congressman from the Chicago area that had resigned his seat and had moved on to take over the Office of Economic Opportunity. Don asked me to come with him as his assistant director for program development, and he had 2 other deputies, Frank Carlucci, who recently resigned from the Defense Department. He was CIA for a while, the State Department, and a fellow named Wes Yornovic. I couldn't even spell his name.
You can't?
Yornovic. Starts with an H.
Okay.
In any event, we were running OEO, and what intrigued me with Don's appointment was the discretionary dollars. I didn't realize the political... Giving away money is very difficult at best, but at least at the Ford Foundation, it wasn't quite as political as is government. But I had been, a number of presidents from Johnson on that appointed me to a good number of advisory committees. I got some walls full of these appointments. And I've been pretty familiar with the federal program because in the early years of the Ford Foundation, we would be evaluated on a grant in terms of did this go into legislation, did people change the delivery of dollars differently as a result of your program. This was before the Reform Act, where they didn't want us to influence public policy anymore. So I was quite familiar with the federal government. And was at the Office of Economic Opportunity when it became quite difficult, a lot of political problems. It was much more politicized than under other administrations. President Nixon felt he wanted better, more control, and his discretionary dollars from the other agencies were put under control, and I was responsible for all this discretionary money. It was very difficult to keep on top of it. And I knew it was just a matter of time before I'd stumble because it's very difficult keeping control. We're talking, an average few months is 400 or 500 million, and watch it. And I thought I'd better move on. I called Mac, and I was going to go Mac Bundy, and I was going to return to the Ford Foundation. I was quite happy to. While I was at Ford, I'd made good friends, and I worked the international as well as the national. I worked in Nigeria and Colombia and India, just all over the world.
Well, the Ford Foundation really provided you with a lot of opportunity to meet a lot of very important people, right?
Oh, I'll be always grateful to the Ford Foundation for the opportunity of trying ideas and having the resources. But I found it extremely difficult cajoling others. It was a lot easier. I learned later in life it's a lot easier getting grants and running projects myself than it is trying to find people who are ready to implement the ideas. And I found the foundation work extremely frustrating because I could never find the talent. We'd have the ideas and the trustees would appropriate the money. But it was so difficult finding grantees that didn't have a hidden agenda.
You're right.
And that's what's difficult.
And essentially you were acting as a kind of consultant, in a consulting role as opposed to an implementing role.
In this yes,
particular
and in the same sense,
right.
in a very careful way, because people will follow money anywhere, and the idea is not to develop a marriage with a grantee, but to keep it somewhat of a distance. So I found it very frustrating. A lot of people love it. I just think giving away money is a lot harder than getting it. In any event, when I went back to Ford, or I was in the process of going back to Ford, I had a funny look on my face, I guess, because Max said, "What's the matter?" Because you got a good chance. I'll give you the whole West African program.
Yeah,
what do you want?
Nigeria,
I said, "I'm just tired of throwing money at problems." And he said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I don't know. I think I'd like to be a college president." The reason I said that, it was at the height of all the riots.
Right, in 68, yes, you really were.
In 70,
Sure.
and it was Cambodia, and he laughed and said, "My God, I know of 200 open right now. It must be a masochist." And I began getting invitations for interviews. I was out interviewing at Case Western, at the University of California, at Santa Cruz, University of New Mexico. And I was pretty well settling on a Midwestern university when I got a call from Ernie Boyers, who was Chancellor of the State University of New York. Ernie called me in Washington and said, "I understand you're looking for presidency." And in fact, my response was, "Thanks a lot, Ernie, but I think I've already got one." And we were at a very silly time. My wife didn't particularly like the president's house because there were common rooms on the first 2 floors in the faculty club.
In which college was
this? Was in Ohio.
In Ohio,
and
Northwestern.
And our children were smaller then, and she didn't want to kind of raise them there. So they were telling me to go out and find a house. We were just at that funny stage. When Ernie said to asked me if I'd ever heard of Harper College in Binghamton, I said vaguely, why? He said, "Well, we're taking it over. It's going to be State University of New York at Binghamton, and as part of our takeover, I could name the first president, and I really think you belong in the public sector. You really belong in the independent sector. And why don't you and Dorothy go up and take a look at Binghamton and consider it?" And I said, "Oh, really, I want the boonies." He said, "Well, I think you ought to, but by the way, I need a favor. Did you ever hear of FIT?" And I said, "No, what's an FIT?" And then he got a little hysterical. You're supposed to be the footnote in the history of vocational technical education. You never heard of this and never did. I'm really surprised. Anyway, it's one of our units, and they are about to recommend somebody for the presidency. I don't think I should purpose of oral history tell you who it was, but we're going to have a problem with him in that our board won't approve it. State University of New York won't approve the local board's appointment. and I don't have a candidate, and I don't have anybody to say, I don't have anything, if you get somebody like, and I feel very vulnerable, and if you'd go down and do me a favor, and just, I know you're not going to want it, I know your scope is much larger, but if you go down there and interview for me, Binghamton's yours, and you really belong there. So I just last Ernie, I managed to Binghamton, but look, I'll go down. So I came on campus, and Shirley Goodman was acting president, and she'll remember this because I put my feet, I was just terribly rude.
This was 1970?
70, it was 70.
Yep.
It was 70, 71. In that,
well, but you became president
in 71, so it was just before
maybe,
that,
yeah.
70.
Yeah, okay.
And I remember I hadn't made an appointment, or I may have made I hadn't made an appointment because her secretary asked me, and I said, no, I'd like to see you there. And they were a little flustered. But anyway, I walked in the room and put my feet up on her desk and suggested that it might be a good idea if they interviewed me. And she said, well, thank you very much, but we've already selected the president. And I said, well, it's not public yet. And, but I was terrible. It was awful. When I think back on it, it really was hysterical. So they did. They opened up the interviews, put the committees through, and I wasn't in the beginning at all serious about it. I was just going through the motions for Ernie. And you remember at that time all we had was this building we're in, the C building, and there were some skeletons around. And I remember coming. The interviews were also very, very touching. I've been through a process of other colleges, and they had students and faculty and the union and trustees, and the Educational Foundation, and alumni, all these various groups interviewing me, and each would have a different...
I hope at a separate time.
A separate time,
yeah.
But it was hard to believe they were talking about the same institution, or as they viewed the problems, they were so different. It was almost sort of cute. I came back for a second interview, and I came early, because of the shuttle or whatever from Washington. I was sitting out on the front stoops, and a young man came up to me who had been part of the student. He was president of the student association that had interviewed me the week before. And he was from Australia, the president of the student association. And he recognized me. He sat down, and we started chatting on the stoops of the C building. And I said, well, tell me about this place. You're from Australia. How'd you find it? He began telling me about FIT, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought, good Lord, the 60s had sort of passed this place, and the potential here was absolutely enormous.
Yeah, the 60s, from anything I've been able to gather, really passed this place by entirely.
Yeah, they just went by it. And they were looking inward for whatever reasons, but they were not really, and there was sort of the self-esteem of the institution wasn't anywhere near what it should be, or should have been. The issues, then all of a sudden all those interviews clicked in my head. I began to understand what they were probing for. They did not have a very good opinion of themselves, and had no idea that this
You're talking now about administration trustees.
The entire institution did not understand that they were better than Harvard, that they were light years ahead of where education, and education wasn't even in the league of the bases of the creation of this institution. There was such a forward-looking criteria. This was an institution created by people who were denied their own opportunity for schooling, and had they said they're graduates of Coat and Suit and 7th Avenue, who had a burning zeal and appreciation for what education could be and should have been.
You're talking about the Morris
Halves, the Morris
Max
Halves.
Myers,
and as you read the incorporation papers, it was sheer genius. And then the early people who developed this institution through design or accident were right on target on the mix of general and vocational, the purposes of education for working people, things that today we take for granted. When you think back then when they were formulating the policies of this college, I thought they were quite profound. And the self-image was very bad because the image, I think, of the industry themselves wasn't, they weren't proud. It was somehow noble to go into the hard goods and, and degrading to go into soft goods. I don't know where. And luckily I didn't come from that background. I was able to look at it much more objectively than people who were in it. And I became very much intrigued with it. And I wondered if I had really alienated everybody here because of my sort of smart-ass way of dealing with interviews. But I went down to 8th Avenue and 28th Street. There was a delicatessen on the corner with a payphone on it. in it, and I called Ernie and said, Ernie, I'm back here for my second or third interview, and I don't know, I've been so silly about it. But I'll tell you, the place is more serious than you may think it is. And I think I'm going to really put my oar in it, and when I get to the next board meeting, I had one meeting with Andy Goodman and Dave Zelinka and John Brooks, who was chairman of John Brooks, who's chairman of the board of Celanese Corporation, was the chairman of the selection committee of our board. And I was being kind of cutesy with them all. I didn't research the place. Normally, if you're serious about a job, you do a little background.
Sure.
But I didn't even know who David Zelinka was or Andy. I'd never been to Bergdorf Goodman, so I didn't even care about what he. So I hadn't done any of that, and really didn't know what I was. But I called Ernie and said, "I'd like to be serious about it." He said, "Of course you should be serious about it." He said, "You don't belong at Case Western, and you don't belong at Binghamton. These are the places made for you. It's kind of a great marriage, and you ought to go to FIT." So I called him, and then I got back on track with the interviews. Another strange thing happened. Mac Bundy wasn't aware that I was doing this, and I think it was John, but one of our board members knew Mac. They'd gone to school together, and they called Mac for a reference. And Mac says something kind of silly. He said, Marvin Scope is far beyond the modeling school, which is then the image of the Fashion Institute. I mean, either you were in a rag business, which I hate, every time I hate that, I don't want to choke somebody, or modeling school, those characterizations. And I went to my third interview, they were quite hostile. And I couldn't understand. I said, I have obviously offended you. Why are you wasting our time? We know for a fact. And I said, well, the facts are wrong. In any event, that's how I came to FIT. One of the statements that in my early meeting with Ernie Boyers, in my early conversation as I was going through I had to be interviewed again by the board here in the SUNY board. And at the SUNY board interview, at the board meeting, I suggested that before they agreed to my appointment, to understand that I was going to drive them a little crazy, that in the first place I didn't intend to have FIT, I intended FIT to be a model community college for the year 2000, which does not preclude, in my thinking, anything necessary to meet the management needs of the industries, and I use that as a plural, and that I intended to go into baccalaureate and graduate education as well as do compensatory remedial one-year programs, and I think that I'm going to upset the system because we're not going to fit in what the cartel of higher education now looks like between the colleges and universities, so be careful because I will drive you crazy, and we're not going to let loose until the model is built. And we talked about the model. I wanted to build a new model of higher education, a sort of an urban version of the land-grant college, which was a great piece of social legislation. And that it won't be easy because we'll offend the ACT Techs, will offend the arts and science colleges, will offend the state university and university centers. The way the university is organized, everybody has a certain part of education, and I was going to cross it all. And
You're talking about the State University?
State University of New York, or all of education, matter of fact, public or private, they sort of, educators behave as though it's a cartel. They sort of divide it up, and I wasn't going to sit for that. So if they agreed to my appointment, be prepared. Ernie's response, and I'll always adore Ernie. He said, "Look, I know, we've known each other for a long time, and I know you're that way, but I promise you that I won't fight you, but I won't support you." And I know exactly what you're saying. If you pull it off, that's why all those bills. That's why I had to write legislation to get all this done. Because the university, his position was, I'm not going to fight you, but I'm not going to support you. Don't even discuss it.
Why?
Well, because there was too much political pressure on him.
I see.
If they allow the Fashion Institute to go into baccalaureate degree programs, well, every other college in the state will want to do that. If they let the Fashion Institute go into graduate education, well, for crying out loud, where do you draw the line? And there are other institutions who feel that they have just as good a case to make as we do. So, in any event, that's how I got here. And having arrived, it was not the happiest of times. There was a need, in my opinion, my first task was to change the climate. And the climate in this place was very, very uptight. People would walk around the hallways with the contract in their pocket. They would read the paragraph 5, subset C, there were mumbling little meetings in the hallways.
Is this faculty or administrators?
Faculty and staff, faculty. Well, the administrators were just, we'd have a board, I'd have an administrative meeting, and I'd say something, and I'd hear a mumble, and I'd say, I'm sorry, what did you say? And I said, I want to, what's the hidden agenda? And I said, what's the hidden agenda? What do you really mean? Well, why isn't what I'm saying is what I mean? Well, why would you be maybe using string libertine? I don't know. And I had a particular, of all the management tasks of plan, as a matter of fact, I reversed the usual way of managing with, plan, you organize, you control. So climate setting to me was the most important, because until I had a critical mass of people who wanted to share the dream, we weren't going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
Now, the outward task was the fiscal. The college, we had a deficit with the retirement system. The building program was dead in the water. I mean, there were just terrible fiscal problems. I used to have to plead with the Board of Ed on a Thursday to get the payroll for Tuesday. I remember memos and meetings. I implore you. I have people who have to pay their rent. We had quite a fiscal, so that was the outward. People thought that's really what I was concerned about. I wasn't as concerned about that as much as it took up so much of my time as I was about climate. So we did so many things back then. We sent the faculty off on tea groups. We had weekend. We had 72-hour mini teas in retreat centers. I did anything to get them open. People cried. I removed the chairperson from one of the departments. We did the same thing with students. We started something called the Buck Hill Retreats for Student Leadership. I wanted to get at the more humanistic. Let's trust each other a little bit, and let's not be afraid to cry a little and laugh a little and show a little emotion. And let's get, we're in a noble cause here, and that's what we spent the early years on.
What was your student population like?
Oh Lord, we were small. In fact, my operating budget last year was $40 million. My '73 operating budget, which I remember so well, was under $9 million. So we were a very small institution. We had about 1,000 students during the day, or maybe 1,200. Not 7,000, 8,000 during the day. I mean, it really was a different world, and we had fewer majors, which is why I think you should talk to Frank Shapiro, because because of Frank, we were into a lot of jewelry design and advertising. And those were all parts of Frank's fine arts department at one time. But in any event, the task then was to get the building program going again, to develop a high morale institution with a dream and a vision and a sense of direction, and then to deliver the dream that the people who created the place really wanted. And without, and this is more difficult than it sounds, it's easy to go from a 2-year college to a 4-year college to a university. But the history of education tells us very clearly there's never been a 2-year institution that has become a first-rate 4-year institution. And they usually are the first-rate 2-year institutions that try. Ohio College of Applied Science, Oregon Tech, Pratt Institute. They've never really got to the major, and I didn't want that to happen with us. And we had to do it very carefully. We have something designed here which is quite silly until you look at it. It's an upside-down curriculum. It's 2 on 2 on 2. And we go from the special to the general, not the general to special. And to get that ingrained in the faculty, and get the faculty and my board of trustees in order to understand that the heart and soul of this institution is still the student and the student needs as we meet industry's needs. But industry never has all the right answers anyway. They wouldn't give us the Etzel. We have to lead them a little bit too. So it was a very complicated task. Today we're all glib about it. We have a 2 on 2, an upside-down curriculum. The 2-year institutions, heart and soul. Look, everybody talks the same party line, but to get them from X to Y was Y to X or X.
I'm sorry, but we did go a little more into this business of 2 on 2.
Well, the American educational system is fashioned in such a way that people have to make, first of all, they have to make a decision. If you go vocational education, you foreclose any future education. We divide curriculum up into the fine arts and the practical arts and the liberal arts, whatever terms you want to put to it, and whatever level we talk about. Once you've made that commitment, there are no crossovers. We believe here at FIT that you don't educate people at all unless they're educated in the fine arts and in the liberal arts and in the practical arts. You must have a coherent program. They must reinforce each other. That's the first problem. The second problem is that in community colleges, we're a community college.
Right.
But nowhere in the history of the creation of the community college, the Truman Commission created community colleges. Nowhere did they ever say it should be 2 years, yet that's the party line. It turned out for political reasons to keep the enrollments down in higher ed, the war babies, the veterans. We created a system of 2-year community colleges as really bastard institutions, and they were given a distinct mission. The mission was to do the first 2 years of university work for people who couldn't afford to go on, to do occupational technical, and there were a few takers in those days. We used to dream about someday having 30% of that, and now it's over half. And they used to do compensatory remedial.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the mission, and that was the party line. I wanted to show that a community college is more than that. First of all, this is a different kind of community college in that the community is an industry. It's not geographic. It's not called Chelsea College. This is the Fashion Institute. So the industry is our community.
Right.
And if that community has a different set of needs, if it has a new need for a master's program in management and it's not getting it,
right,
that's our responsibility to give it to them. If they need a tailor and they're not getting it, that's our responsibility to give it to them. So I will not be constrained in the rubric under which we offer education. We'll provide this industry whatever it needs to succeed and flourish, whatever its human needs are. On the education side, American education is fashioned in higher education, and for most students this is true. They need a year of the humanities, a year of the natural sciences, a year of the social sciences. After all, they are 17 years old. They don't know really what direction to go. They really don't know what their skills are. Their self-esteem is very low. They feel quite useless. And they need a general education before they can make those decisions. And that's generally so. So when you and I went to school in the public sectors anyway, non-military sectors, we had a year that in the humanities, and so then we majored in something lit or this.
Mm-hmm.
And we never worried about who we were and how we were going to survive economically, how we were going to get rid of that feeling of uselessness until we went to professional schools.
Right.
And that's how it's fashioned. We would argue that that's generally true. We have no quarrel with it. But we'd also argue that there are a good number of students today, for whatever reasons, television and so on, pretty well know, they know that they don't know quite what to do. They may be artistic and they don't know quite to do with it. Or they may know that they want something in business, but they don't know quite what to do with it. And they know they've already made up their mind, and they have a different agenda. They want to know, what am I good at? What can I do better than average? How do I get rid of this feeling of uselessness? And they want that up front. They don't want to wait. And they're kids in a hurry. By the way, they're hard to find because on profile SAT scores or SPOS time, whatever you look at, you can't tell them. But they have a different style. And that's the style you see when you come on my campus now at FIT. You see the
And they
style.
have a different motivation.
They have a different agenda. They kind of feel, I hate to use the word misfit because I don't mean it in that sense, but they've always felt they didn't quite fit in wherever they were. They were role-playing a lot. They were never quite satisfied back in high school. I mean, they do things because the other kids were doing it. But never felt they belonged because they were listening. They had a different agenda. And they never really opened up until they got here because this school really deals with these kinds of kids. In any event, we wanted to fashion an institution that said, okay, find out what it is you do better than average in your first 15 weeks. What's the error? A 17-year-old coming to FIT has to declare a major. I mean, that's not done anywhere. And we say, if you can't declare a major, go someplace until you're ready to. Well,
This is 1970. It's not. Is it still?
Oh, sure. That's what intrigued me about the Fashion Institute.
Okay.
That they intuitively were on target through design or whatever way they did it. That was a major attraction to the Fashion Institute for me, from an educational point of view. They already had built into it this whole business of make your commitment.
Mm-hmm.
It had a recruitment problem as a result of that. Constant recruitment until we dealt with it. What the kid's going to say, I want to go into textile technology or apparel production. And we had to recognize that. But generally, that's why the kids who want to go into, that's why fashion, and by fashion we had another issue, and Shirley talks to this real well about educating the people that fashion doesn't mean apparel. But that was popular because kids want to go in those directions. But these other 19 majors were difficult to develop. In any event, I'm getting off target. The mission then was to, first of all, get the building program under. And the building program was a part of a 10-year plan. And much of the plans did not quite meet the needs 10 years later.
Mm-hmm.
There were still things in the plans, hot lead type and linotype machines and advertising and all that kind of stuff. And we had a lot of problems with that because we were only allowed 15% change orders, and I think the first month I was here we had about 40% change orders until they put a halt to it. We also had to piece together the financing of it because there were very little data. One of the architects, Key-Man, died, DeYoung at the end of Moskowitz. And Moskowitz was the artist and DeYoung was the manager, and the city administrations had changed 3 times. We had gone from 2 different mayors, and there weren't any records, and meanwhile we had the whole state funding and the federal funding. So we had to piece all that together, which we did, and got to a mark. We went from 46 to 64 to $82 million just in a few months.
Do you have a marvelous financial officer?
Mm-hmm. What I did is I brought in a very hard-nosed person from the private sector who had never been in the public sector, but had gone through this kind of growth in private industry with aluminum companies. And I didn't want a public financier. I wanted somebody with a private view. Brought Fred Blatt in to handle the
So he's been here since for a long time.
Well, he came in a few years later because I had Murray Gershon. I had, meanwhile, we had we had an internal union problem. We had to get that thing set aside. There was a lot of...
A professional union? Teachers union?
Yeah, the teachers union. They were quite militant. It seemed my predecessor made some public statements, which maybe... I've known Larry for years. I don't think he really met him.
This is Lawrence Bethel.
No, Jarvie.
Oh, Lawrence Jarvie, excuse me.
But I knew Larry when he was vice chancellor, and I knew him when he was commissioner. But it caused a lot of... I think he lost his temper a few times. Publicly, maybe he shouldn't have done that, but he did. So they were all armed and ready to go to war, so we had to deal with that particular problem. And slowly evolved into what we are today, and that's it was a major at a time. We took an enormous amount of abuse in public hearings, moving to the baccalaureate programs.
Let's slow down a little bit. When were you allowed to confer the baccalaureate?
75, I think.
So you came here in 71,
Yeah.
and the first couple of years, I assume, were getting the financial house in order and getting your understanding of the whole situation, the whole culture.
Yeah, we had to
Right.
first of all reorganize the institute. We had to nail down I didn't understand what the marks were for the building program. We had to sit down with directions that we're going to go into. We had to do an awful lot of planning. I have to fill out the old planning books, and come with some reasonable. I had to meet with a lot of chairpersons and faculty and get their views because I had to get a feel for the rigor of the minds that we'd have to rely on, which was very impressive, I must tell you. They really understated here. And we used to meet in the living room. We had meeting after meeting in the living room with department after department, and they would send up their wish list. And we did a lot of silly things. The Liberal Arts Division, I took their sign down when we were all in the C building then, but I took down the sign that said the Division of Liberal Arts, and I put up the Division of General Studies, and it floated up there for about a month or two until somebody noticed it one day. And then the dean was up here in a rage, and I met with the division. I said, let's talk about the difference between the liberal arts and general ed, because you can liberate an artisan from whoever considers their craft, and you can generally educate people. Now, what are we doing? So we played all those silly little games, just get people thinking about ethics, things that we ought to be doing in the world. So we play silly things like that all through the institution. And I spent an enormous amount of time in those days. I haven't done it recently. I miss it, but with each of the departments. And it was fun because it was true when I say, look, I am absolutely ignorant. I don't know. I think a textile converter is a machine, so why don't you educate me about textiles, or why don't you educate me about communications? And they were all eager to do that, so they gave us a marvelous chance where here's somebody who doesn't know a thing.
The learning process was probably
part of the
fun of the whole
well,
thing.
why can't we do this? And, isn't this? And then, so we play all these curriculum. And curriculum was a lot of fun. So we went through those kinds of years. In the meantime, we had to make a lot of friends. FIT is a strange institution, the way it's governed. Who do we work for? We're a city institution, we're really not. We're sponsored by the Board of Education of the City of New York, we're really not. We have a Board of Trustees, the governor appoints 4 and the Board of Ed appoints 5, and we work for those people, but where do they end? There's the Educational Foundation, which is official advisory committee for federal money. What's their role?
For federal money or for
Grants.
federal grants? Okay.
We have to negotiate our own budget with the Office of Management and Budget. I have to still go up to Albany. By the way, every time we have a resolution, the board has to approve it. It has to go to the city, it has to go to the Board of Ed, it has to go to SUNY, and we have to appear, and we have to get on agendas. And we have to, we have to negotiate those things. And it quickly became evident to me that we better make some friends. And there's a funny mentality in Albany. For a lot of people, New York south of New Paltz doesn't exist. We're really two states, and we have a New York delegation, which sometimes are very helpful and sometimes are not. And I find the chairman of Higher Education Committee is Kenny Laval, but Kenny is from Suffolk, and Warren Anderson is from Broome, and I quickly learned that I really couldn't rely. State universities, I love the state universities. They're really marvelous people, and I adore them. And we never do anything to harm the chancellor. But they have a different agenda. They have university centers and medical schools, and they have to build a school down at Stony Brook, and they have all these other agendas. And we'd have to wait in those days for supplemental and budget deficiency when I could go do my own lobbying. So we became, we had to spend a lot of time making friends with the people who turn these taps on and off in both the city of New York and the state of New York. So I could be on one-on-one terms with the speaker, whoever the speaker may be, and be on one-on-one terms with the chairman of the Higher Education Committee and the budget committees, and then learn to deal with the governor's office. And so we spent a lot of time in those years because I knew we were going to need legislative support on the programs we want to get to. So in those early years, while it was around budget, all the meetings were money. We go out of our way to make friends with Bill Passananti, the Speaker Pro Tem, with whoever the Stanley Fink's the Speaker now, but whoever the speakers were then, and Jerry Kremer, Ways and Means, just so that when we were ready, at least we'd be on talking terms.
Right.
And the same thing.
It's an incredible consortium, isn't it?
It's really a management nightmare in that one has to have a lot of courage to move prior to resolutions being approved. If I have to wait, if I have to wait, the calendar or the clock ticks on. Sometimes it's 6 months. I don't get for example, one of the reasons we were always in a problem with meeting payroll. Sometimes I don't get my first quarter payment until Christmas, and it comes in quarterly payments, and one has to have a little bit of risk, willingness to risk a little bit, and go ahead and do things before they get ready. For example, we have all the majors in the art and design building were not even registered, and we had kids in the program, but I've had to wait for the state ed department to finally approve a program in hand knits, or in hand knits will come and go, or in jewelry design, or all those majors. We had programs done underway here, don't let the paper flow, because the bureaucrats work on a different calendar than we do. Kids come to the Fashion Institute in August, and they graduate in June, and in January there's certain marks, and if you don't make the move then, you have another year. So we just went out and did all these crazy things, and got a lot of gray hair, but and made friends along the way. When the time then came to move FIT to the status it now enjoys, I was able to find any number of legislators willing to introduce legislation. By the way, in the midst of all that, we had to make friends with the state ed department, because everything in New York State is under the Regency of the University of the State of New York, and that's a whole other division of bureaucrats and systems. And the processes were quite ugly, because we have to first request permission from our own competition, the independent sector, and we have Regents for hearings, and they say nasty things about us. Then we have to appeal it, we go to the Regents. And see, getting legislative authority means that you have the authority to do it, but you're not allowed to offer a program until it's registered with the Regents in this state. So
in effect, there has to be a certificate of need.
And then you have to, and it's tough. But we had a lot of fun because we were on the right track. And
I am curious, though, how did you learn all of this? All these complications, all these people to be dealt with?
I guess because of my federal experience. When you at the other end, I had to learn when I was the Fed, when I was responsible for millions and millions of dollars of federal money. that the delivery system to the states had to go through these processes that you deal with the regions, the State University of New York or community college. So the federal experience, a couple of years in federal government, gave me a pretty good picture of the governance and how local boards, in some states, for example, they're elected and not appointed. But the processes of dealing with communities, when we work in Indianapolis with the mayor on a sweat equity housing project, where you begin to understand what the role of the city council is and boards of supervisors. So it's the first time anybody ever asked me that. It's just not that way. I just always knew it, but I guess it really wasn't. It really was through that experience. It was also, people were very helpful to me here. I honestly, I couldn't spell I spell fashion, but I really didn't understand the role of the joint board and of the outerwear and children's wear and all the guys I hang around with now.
And the impartial chairman.
And what's the role of the ILG. And people were very, very helpful to me. They tried so hard to catch me up to what I should have known just walking into this job. We have 19 colleges here because in interior design, there's the American Association of Interior Designers, and they have their politics.
Right.
In advertising, they have theirs, and their boards, and their accrediting. By the way, in addition to the normal accrediting middle states and all that stuff that you have at colleges, FIT also has the professional accreditation. And in each of their groups, for example, when we wanted to go into packaging, I had to discover there's something called the American Packaging Council, and who's the greatest. And that's how we run into people, these great guys like Laszlo Roth that we bring on the campus. So each there's the American Association of Apparel Manufacturers, and they have their entire organization. There's textile distributors and textile technologists and all of their kinds of things. When I'm at any meeting at any one time, I have to be as up to date and knowledgeable. Well, the kids are competing in an advertising contest, and I have to go to they just assume that I know the advertising women in New York and that I know what these national competitions are. So I had to spend an awful lot of time at least getting to a speaking knowledge or an appearance of knowledge in all these other areas. People assume I know the difference between conservation, preservation, and restoration. I mean, they say I better damn well know that because when I'm with the restoration people, I better speak restoration. So it's a very difficult institution to manage in that it's not a monolithic. It's not just one program of the liberal arts or engineering college or a college of art and design.
No, the disciplines are many.
They're many.
Very different.
And it's also part of the fun of the Fashion Institute. The battles through the legislation on the baccalaureate and master's programs took up an enormous amount of time. The bachelor's much more than the master's because it was what I had discovered along the way that I hadn't spent as much time with KICU, the Council of Independent Colleges and Universities in New York State, as I had on the public side, and going through the viciousness of the baccalaureate programs, and I had my deans with me a couple of times, but then they were getting a little demoralized, so I kind of try to isolate them a little bit. But, between the bachelor's and the master's, I spent a good deal of time with the independent sector people, making friends with Hank Paley, who's the executive director, presidents of the independent sector. So we got a dialogue going that wasn't trying to put them out of business, and we really weren't talking about those kinds of things. So, well, this has been a little difficult for the masters. The regents will be meeting on it next month. I'm almost positive it'll be passed. They complained it was much milder than the others. In the meantime, we have to build bridges to the industries. FIT will never forget our roots of 7th Avenue, and we'll never forget that it was the 7th Avenue geniuses that created the Fashion Institute. But in the meantime, we've grown off of 7th Avenue. We've become a national, if not an international institution. And we've moved from, with almost an equal partnership now in leadership with the industries, the conferences we hold on high technology, the seminars that we run, the technical assistance that we now provide. We're just an equal partner in an industry now, the buyer retraining programs that we do. Today, FIT and the industry it serves are one and the same. Sam Feinberg writes in his comments, it's difficult to find the line of demarcation, and all that's true because there is none. Their problems are our problems. If Liz Claiborne wants to go into the Bronx, we're going to help build a factory in the Bronx. And And if old Charlie has an offshore problem in Taiwan and pattern making, we'll go to Taiwan, and we try to balance the people who support us and the success of our industries. And I think our alumni have proven over the past 40 years that this college is on the right track. One of our frustrations at FIT is that the showbiz part of fashion design is easy to publicize.
Mm-hmm.
You can talk about Norma Kamali and Calvin Klein and John. And by the way, I adore them all.
I understand perfectly.
But the no-namers, the people in apparel production who are key to this industry, and interior design, there's nobody in the country as good as we are in interior design. My own son is a graduate of our advertising design program, and he turned Princeton down to come here. Those kids, these are the no-namers, and they're slowly, they're slowly
Very
moving, and we're fairly new, but in another decade, we'll be as famous there as we are in the fashion design area. In the meantime, we went through some interesting governance changes in the Fashion Institute, which makes it extremely difficult today. Today, when I arrived, the best job in the Fashion Institute was to be a dean, and today that's about the worst job. We've reversed the responsibilities quite a bit at the Fashion Institute, and we've proven at the price of my poor deeds. I feel sorry. I would hate to have to report to me, but we reversed the management decisions, so we decentralized them as far as we can. We pushed them down as far as we can, putting the responsibility where it really belongs. There's no way all the slick materials in the world, all the resources you bring to an institution, cannot create the classroom climate unless people feel good about themselves. If the faculty feels good about themselves and wants to share their knowledge, and the students feel good about themselves and their self-esteem is such that they could learn, we'll be a successful institution. And the other way, we used to appoint chairpersons. Now we elect them. This causes lots of management problems on recall, but we never really had a problem with it. Most of the problems now are that it's difficult to manage in an environment that requires consensus management, but nonetheless, we're light years ahead in humanistic studies. We're light years ahead in consensus. We were doing consensus management before people were talking about the Y and Z theories that Peter Drucker was writing about. And it does work, but it works at a terrible price, and the price is at the people that report to me, because they in turn manage divisions which have chairpersons or directors who in turn manage people, and the requirement is constant consensus. So it makes it a very difficult management task, but when accomplished, a superb institution.
What it means then is that you as president have reporting directly to the deans, who then have reporting to them the chairperson.
No, they don't report. See, there's where it breaks down.
Okay.
We in administration serve the faculty. And we serve. I can, without any discussion with anybody, decide I'm going to go into giftware industry. I'm going to do that. I look at my discretionary budget and I say, well, why don't you come in and work for me? I will tell you, I want to set up this. I really want to go into that field.
Well, that's a question I have.
Okay, I can hire you on the spot. You, in turn, will bring your own faculty in. And the college will provide for you recruiting materials, and we'll brief our admissions officers, and we'll get you a class. And you will start your career here. At the end of the 4th year, whether you remain as chairman of that department is going to depend on whether the department now elects you as chairperson. What we did is separate out two issues that have plagued other colleges. Where we're going and how we're getting there is my board's responsibility, which means it's my responsibility. So if I want advice, I'll ask for it. What you do and how you teach and when you run it belongs to you. I'm not going to intervene with that. You get out of my way on where we're going with this college, and I'll get out of your way on the substance, except for review, curriculum review, and placement office close. And we have accountability built into the system because of it. We have built-in placement. We have built-in curriculum changes. We have process built in. But politically, I'm not going to bring all my buddies in and appoint them chairpersons. I'm not going to give sabbaticals just on the basis of longevity. All this we'll discuss. And so it makes it a difficult management task for a dean of a division, where in fact, suppose I want to remove you as chairperson. my deans have to do the following. They first have to go to the department and say, we have a problem. There's two ways to remove a chairperson. Management may decide, or the faculty may decide.
I see.
Okay, so the faculty may decide they want to, if the faculty decides, it takes 2/3 of their vote. By the way, they're only appointed for 2 years, so they always have a shot at it. But if management decides they want to remove a chairperson, first of all, the Dean of Academic Affairs has to meet with the department and say, we're going to ask for a recall. Unless you can answer the following questions, here's what's happening. The department then votes. The dean says, I'm not satisfied. I want to pursue removal. So they vote. If my dean doesn't get 50% of the vote, not 2/3, that's 50, then she cannot remove the chairperson. However, she can come back to me and say, listen, I had a vote, and half the faculty didn't want to go, no. But I'm telling you, if you don't remove this person, we're going to go down a rabbit hole. Okay, I then have a third step. I could appoint 3 people, and the union can appoint 3 people, independent of the department. See, now we're all this governance stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they then advise me whether I can remove them or not. I can only do that once a year, and if they say no, your deans are wrong or the managers are wrong, but they understand what the criteria would be for removal. So one, either you have enough faith. Here's the issue: you have enough faith in the general level and commitment of the faculty that they really give a damn, and have maybe as much wisdom as management, and you rely on a combination for that kind of a decision, or you don't. And it's difficult to be a dean when the dean doesn't have that 5th area of management, which is reward and punish. My managers cannot reward and they cannot punish. And if you can't reward and you can't punish, most people, the management can't exist. So it requires an awful lot of persuasion to manage in this kind of an environment. And not everybody is successful in it.
When you say this kind of environment, you mean the academic environment or the particular FIT academic environment?
Well, it's what I've just said is generally
It's
true.
generally true, okay.
But it's a little bit more severe here because we're not dealing with 2 divisions, we're dealing with 19 colleges. And
Each of these divisions is considered a separate college?
No,
I
but
mean,
they do.
You're talking...
They
I
do.
see.
They
Okay,
do.
okay.
When I was managing the Cogswell Polytechnical College, it was marvelous. I had machine design, structural design, and electronics design. So it was all engineering, had all engineering faculties, and I'm dealing with an engineering style, and it was easy to manage it.
Right.
Here I've got artists in illustration, and hard-nosed people with cooler virtues of business and marketing, and you're dealing with different mental sets and different approaches to problems. And it's an extremely difficult management task.
Is it possible for you just to draw me a verbal picture of what the structure really is? Because I'm not clear.
Sure. The board of the actual employer of the Fashion Institute are these 9 souls we work for. Right? And they're set by law. It can't be 10 or 11. It's 9. We work for them. I am their chief executive officer. They can remove me, and I work for that group. Reporting to me is, first of all, an executive assistant to the president who really runs FIT, and that's Vicki Barbero, because anything that gets past her is really a problem. And I guess I'd say 80% of the problems she solved long before. She's an ombudsman, and God knows what a ridiculous title, but she runs my wife as well. But I have a dean of academic affairs. I have a dean of students. I have the treasurer of the college. I have the vice president for development. That's the top management team.
Development, meaning fundraising?
Yeah. Well, not really, because the foundation is fundraising. It means community relations. It means college advancement. I also have the secretary of the college is responsible for publications as well. That's my management team. Each division has a dean. There's a dean of liberal arts. There's a dean of art and design. There's a dean of business and technology. There's a dean of liberal arts.
Each of the 19 divisions.
Yeah, and they report to my dean of academic affairs. Now, each of these deans have department chairpersons. In the art and design division, there's illustration and advertising and interior design and photography and jewelry design. They report to the dean of the art and design division. In the business and technology division, we have apparel production, textile technology, fashion merchandising, advertising, communications. They report to that dean. The liberal arts dean has social sciences, the humanities, economics, all that stuff. Reports at physical education. They report to that dean. when I say they report to the dean really reports to them. The dean's responsibility is managing the division, making sure there's resources for people come on campus on August 25th, and they expect 12,000 bodies, they expect rooms to be ready, they expect books to be ordered, they expect programs to be in place.
They expect courses to be revised if necessary.
No, we have,
No?
We have within the structure of the college committees, standing committees that do academic standards, curriculum review, placement review, buildings and grounds. These are, by the way, these aren't cutesy-poo. They're working committees. For example, in curriculum alone, last year alone, we did at least 120 serious revisions of the total instructional program in this institution. And they go through, now they can come down or they can come up. I also, up until the fiscal crises, had the Futures Committee. We would sit around on Fridays and dream up new majors. But right now, I'm kind of cool that we haven't got enough room anymore. We now have a new division, a graduate division, because next year we'll have 3 master's degree programs. And Robert Gutman's another dean who's on the cabinet. He doesn't report to me, he reports to Janice as well. He runs that. In the meantime, we have Richard Martin, who is the executive director of the Resource Center, and he floats but as needed, because sometimes he's part of the cabinet when it deals with his libraries over there, and sometimes he's part of another group when it has to do with gallery exhibits, so it's kind of a crazy job.
It's a staff function, isn't it?
It's a staff function, yet every one of them have line responsibilities because they have people who report to them. They have to make sure they're at work, and they have to make sure their vacation schedules are scheduled, and their sick days are really sick days. They have a budget and a budget responsibility, so they both have line and staff functions, but they have very little authority. They have responsibility without authority, and that's the frustrations of this kind of management. Usually deans pay their dues and vice presidents pay their dues on their way to presidency. And the frustration level that builds up at the Fashion Institute is that we're just a big family, and they do stay on as professional deans.
Right.
And it's very frustrating because all of us in my business rate ourselves on what happened to our subordinates and how well do they do after they left us. And this is the first place I've ever been where
Nobody leaves you.
They stay on and on. I love them. Don't misunderstand. I'm not trying to say I want them to go on. But they just do it, and it makes their jobs very, very difficult because...
Right, yes, I'm sure it does. Could you take one department and go through it from the start of it to where it is, when it finally becomes a place where people study?
All right, in the Fine Arts Department, some years ago, there was a jewelry design class. It became evident that jewelry as a field, well, let me go backwards. There was kids were selling jewelry on the street corners in the early 70s, and the police were arresting them and busting them. And my niece was visiting us from California, and we always showed the village as you always do.
Sure.
We were walking around the village, and there was a policeman beating on a kid, and blood was coming out of the kid's ear, and they were hauling him in the wagons. These were the kids, these little vendors selling jewelry on the street. I came back to FIT, and I called my seminar director and suggested that we ought to run a seminar on how to market handcrafted items because there are other ways to do this, and she did, and we started the program. Then it occurred to me that, there's another side to this, and that's jewelry that's not handcrafted. And there's a pretty big jewelry industry. How big is it? So we began looking at it, and I asked Frank who the best guy in this department was, and it was a fellow named Sam Visor. So we said, Sam, how about creating a department? And, well, he said, I always wanted to, but I didn't know the college did, and how does Frank feel about it? And so we said, well, Sam, I'll release you from your teaching duties and keep you on salary, and I'll appoint you as chairperson. Why don't you get a curriculum together? We'll get an advisory committee of jewelry people. So he gets an advisory committee together, and they start working on a curriculum. We give him backup help. Then we we put it through the internal mechanism of the college in terms of cost and space and all that sort of stuff. Then we file for a HEGIS number. That's to get permission.
A what number?
HEGIS is higher education, something. And I have to then go up to State University of New York and make a case for a new major.
You have to have a new major approved.
Oh, sure, by both SUNY and the Board of Ed. No, my own board. First my board approves it. Then I go, Board of Ed has to approve it. Then I have to go to State University, then State Ed Department. And then we find space, and we start, and Sam's got a program in jewelry design.
Now, how long did it take from start to finish, from start to beginning of
Most of our major, like menswear and cosmetics, from beginning to end, 2 years.
2 years. The planning process right on.
Yeah, we're in the middle of one right
The
now on
execution.
advertising and communications for television. Television
yes?
advertising.
Is that a subdivision of your communications
Well,
department?
maybe. We have courses in it now.
Yeah,
But
right.
I believe that writing copy for radio, writing copy for television, and doing storyboards for television, 1-minute concepts are a little different than printed media.
Mhm.
We're the best in the world in printed. There's nobody in our league. And so now the question is, do we want this as a upper division option for BFA? Do we want it as a 2-year associate parallel with the other two? Or do we want it as part of ACAD? So it's now percolating. It's been percolating now for about not quite a year.
Mhm.
And I should be getting a report on it by January and make a decision on it.
Mhm.
Sometimes we make mistakes. We make a lot of mistakes. The first mistake I made, I remember, was back in '76 or '5, '4. I would have bet menswear was going to go quite the way women's wear. The leisure suits and seasonal. Wrong bet. They went quite classic. So our investments were in the wrong direction. There's the textbooks that we commissioned and the curriculum we wrote was way off base. We got to pull it right back into tailoring and that sort of stuff. Sometimes we make other mistakes. We made a mistake. There should be an upper division program on the AAS. Right now we're wrestling with restoration. Antiquing is big business, and the restoring of antiques and antiquities other than art is something that's badly needed. There are people, a lot of jobs out there in this area. Well, as you look, it's a very complicated curriculum. So we're in the middle of the giftware. Giftware is another. It's a $3 billion industry. Sorely needed people. Decorative arts. We want to go into a new management major. Management as it relates to product knowledge. The MBA doesn't have the kind of product knowledge the entrepreneurs have. Our small business center led us to. So we have percolating right now at least a half a dozen new directions we want to go into. Problem now is just space and resources for it. But it never ends. It just can't end. People have theories that are dead wrong about institutional change. You're supposed to level up. You're supposed to become mature. And you go through an entrepreneurial stage, and I'm giving you the management literature. And then you go to a mature stage and a research stage. Well, that's all nonsense. The institution has to constantly be in change. You don't level off and let's tighten it up for a while. And if you're not, it's like life itself. If you don't grow, you die. If you don't replace your cell, if your cell's not replaced every single week, your body stops functioning. You begin to die. Similarly, if this institution never stops changing, it'll die. It'll go down as fast as it went up. So we have to constantly be in, if not really changing, be in the appearance of changing and appearance of planning, and never be satisfied. Always review and always never let it get mature. Never let people think they're complacent. And there's something called the Valley of Despair in management. The institution perks along, and you introduce a change, and it goes into a Valley of Despair. And in theory, if it comes out, it goes up higher than it was, and then goes on again. So the idea is to always keep people into that valley and always have them climb out of that valley, otherwise they get complacent. So we're always in change. People come around, hey boss, come on, let's settle down. We got to tighten up the BFA. We got to tighten up the know our marketing is. Give us a couple of years to smooth it out. And my God, another 169 FTEs and yeah, sure, I can't do that, Charlie. I'll tell you why, and I know you'll fix it. But they want that relief. But I think a chief executive officer's major task is never let that happen, because and this is also true in the corporate world. I mean, that's why everybody's been buying acquisitions. I mean, when's the last time we were doing R&D, and we're just starting to get out of this crazy acquisition? You can't continue growing in America by buying and selling each other.
Right.
Nor can you keep doing the same thing under the guise of smoothing it out. You don't smooth it out. Professors leave and people come in, so you have to always push. You'll always be a little bit unhappy and never praise too much. So it's just assume that they aren't quite there yet. It's an interesting game.
Yeah.
6.
This will be the end of our first interview, and we will continue in about 1 week's time. Well, the Fashion Institute of Technology's Oral History Collections. This will be the second interview with President Marvin Feldman for the project of the oral history of FIT. The date will be November 20th. The interviewer is Mildred Finger.
President Feldman, I noticed that in your baccalaureate program, you have 6 majors which can end up with a BA or BS. Would you tell us what those are and mention also perhaps why you don't have one in retailing?
We have Bachelor of Science degree programs in apparel production, textile production, and marketing. We have BFA programs in packaging and advertising design, interior design, and so on. And we're going into 3 master degree programs next fall in museum and gallery work. The reason that we went to marketing instead of retailing, or why we're not into retailing, is that we've had a lot of meetings on the future of merchandising, retailing, and for better or worse, we think we're right. We think that the major emphasis and need in the decade ahead is going to be in marketing. And retailing, as we know it today, is undergoing so many changes. There's so many different ways of distributing goods, mail order catalogs. We have no idea what's even going to happen with the television communications, off-price centers. There's so many different ways of retailing. That retailing is a traditional program in traffic management, personnel management, the storekeeper functions of retailing. Really requires a lot more study before we're going to move into it again. And I know this doesn't please, this wasn't 100% through our advisory committees. There were many groups in our living room at the wee hours of the morning talking about bringing back the retailing programs. There used to be programs in retailing. There were retailing schools. They made some mistakes in moving toward the MBA. We want to go into a different kind of management. In our graduate center, one of the programs we're thinking about moving into, in fact it's beyond thinking, we've outlined it, was a Master of Management Arts, which is a marketer with product knowledge. But in our opinion, marketing is the key, not retailing currently. And that's why we're not in retailing. Although I would suppose that I would find it a little difficult, except for the small business. Let me qualify this. For the entrepreneurial programs, for the self-employed, for the small business people, we do have a center, a small business center, and we're providing those management skills that normally would be called retailing, but it's not as a retailer in the corporate world. There, I don't think there is a need for retailers. There are people who have to be visual merchants, and everything is changing in retailing. We used to do display and lighting and advertising, marketing. Those are the ways we want to go, not an all-around retailer of running a store. We just don't think the future calls for that.
Well, does your 2-year program?
No, neither does our 2-year program. Our 2-year program is a program of fashion, buying, and merchandising. And we do understand the need in merchandising, what goods to buy, when to buy them, how to display them, how to move them, how to price them. Retailing means something quite different. Retailing deals with salary and wage administration, with traffic management and warehousing and contracting. It's a totally different discipline than the way we approach it. And at FIT, as we do everything else, we go from the specific to the general. Mm-hmm. I'm positive, well, as positive as I could be, but I'm always very positive, that when we have our Master of Management Arts,
we will bring to management in retailing as we will in marketing the sorts of chief executive officers that the industry so badly needs.
How much liberal arts are the retailing students exposed to?
In all of our bachelor degree programs, 50% of the program is in the liberal arts, and in our 2-year associate degree programs, 1/3 of the curriculum is in the liberal arts.
But if you have no bachelor's program for merchandising...
Yes, we do. We don't have it in retailing. We have one in merchandising
I
and
see.
marketing.
Okay, you're making an interesting distinction. President Cohen, let's talk about some of the other things you think are important in the future for FIT, stemming from the industry problems and stemming from your own thinking about what the future will be as you discussed it in Sam Feinberg's column, or at least as you discussed it with Sam Feinberg, in a column which then appeared on October 12th, where you talked about reviewing the GATT Agreement 807 and so forth, and how this will impact on your curriculum.
We look at the fashion industry as a fashion industries. Most people think of the fashion industry strictly in terms of apparel. What the computer revolution has done, in our opinion, is blurred the lines between fiber people and textile people and apparel people and retailers and advertising. It's all blurred. The industries are now in a period of transition. I'm amazed at how many of my colleagues think we're in the middle of a dying industry, which is absurd. It is in a transition that is going to force this institution to take the leadership in blurring the distinctions of the way the industries are organized now and how they operate now. The first step is the transmission of technology to the industries. For example, next week we will hold one of the most sophisticated advanced technology seminars, a 3-day seminar for about 1,000 apparel manufacturers with the most sophisticated demonstrations on the availability of technology. So the first change that we foresee is a blurring of what used to be very distinct, disparate parts of this industry. Second is that we are in a little bit of trouble now. We used to say that the best designers were in America, but now we're facing very, very competitive designs from abroad. As technology is transferred and as we're all equalized in terms of costs, we'll return once again to design as a critical factor in the survival of the industry. So we have to really step up design and spend as much time now in design and the concepts of design as we have over the past decade in technology. We've been just so immersed in technology with CAMSCOs and CAD cams and color graphics and robotics that much of this has been at the price of design, and we have to get back to design and make sure that it has a commensurate amount of attention in this institution. Secondly, we have to take a look at what's happening in marketing. We have the largest market in the world. We've lost 1/3 of it to other countries. We have to reclaim it. And we have to reclaim it by better marketing techniques, which is why I said earlier that the two keys, the technology blurring the distinct functions and the design and market, the market being able to perceive consumer preferences quicker and get them delivered a lot quicker. This leads us to a lot of federal laws, even antitrust regulations, which are somewhat obsolete in this era of technology. To say that a company cannot manufacture fibers and textiles and apparel and retail as an antitrust violation when we face competitive pressures from abroad where that's precisely what they're doing is a little bit archaic. The agreements, the tariff agreements, the 807, the offshore, has to be totally re-examined, and not through the piecemeal approach, but through the fiber, the textiles, the apparel. This all has to be re-examined in the light of what the technology has been doing to us. If you add to this the communications revolution that we're in, we haven't even talked about that yet, and how quickly we can communicate with all parts of the world with each other in two-way communications links, the picture becomes a little bit clearer about the direction of the institution and the direction of our industry. If you remember that the apparel textile industries are, first of all, a $50 billion year industry in this country, but overwhelmingly made up of small businesses and small companies, you begin to see the future very, very clearly. There's only about 300 companies in America the size of Bluebell or Levi Strauss. You can really tick them off and name them very quickly. The rest of the industry are fairly small, and they need an institution such as FIT to be their spokesperson to advance the information that they need and to do the R&D and the management training. So our plans are very clear. We have a good 5-year plan in place. We have an 8-year plan in place. We have a 10-year plan in place. And with certain modifications, it's crystal clear. So it really deals with marketing, high technology, communication.
How much of this planning involves, or does it, preparation of students for working abroad while they are working for American companies, doing some of their work in the Orient, for example? Not, I know you're doing it in Europe, but I meant in the Orient.
This country has our ability to deal with foreign language instruction is scandalous.
I don't mean foreign language instruction necessarily. I mean,
We have 2 programs now in import-export, which is in the curriculum. In fact, we hired a marvelous person, Bruce Peabody. He's been a good number of years in it. We've had any number of faculty persons now in the Orient. We're in Japan 3-4 times a year, in Thailand and Taiwan. The answer to your question is yes, international marketing. First of all, Americans have never really been interested in exporting. Our nation's been a nation, we've been expanding, we're always moving west, and we always had our own markets. And we have never really thought about exporting as being a fundamental concern until very, very recently. We know very little about exporting. We know very little about tariff agreements and common market textile problems and even metric systems and packaging and deliveries. We're dealing with very hostile countries when we deal with exporting, and it has to be done. We know very little about it. We've had, in the 14 years I've been here, at least a half a dozen seminars with the Commerce Department, State Department, just on the whole notion of exporting, but not that much interest yet.
What about students of design learning about working in the Orient while they are working for American manufacturers, but making trips to the Orient and working with their production people?
Well, a lot of our graduates, as you know, people working for Biedermann Industries have to go to Hong Kong and make sure quality assurance is up to snuff. If you ask me the question, are we able to fit it in our curriculum now? We only have about a half a dozen programs of international experiences. Our kids do, in fact, go to Japan and Hong Kong and Europe. But these are short term. These are during the winter month, during January, and during the summers. We haven't really ever been able to organize a program where they're there for a semester, for example, if that's what you have in mind. On the other hand, there are any number of alumni that I know who actually do this now, and so far, if they understand quality and production, it's the cultural aspects that you're talking about. That's pretty hard to fit into a curriculum. We do have semesters abroad in Europe, but we don't have semesters abroad in the Orient, and mainly because of the language problem goes back to languages. We don't do a very good job in really teaching languages. We now have French and Spanish in our curriculum here, but we don't have Japanese. We should. We don't have Chinese. We should. The question is, how do you get it in? How do you fit it? We teach in Chinese in Chinatown. We have a number of contracts. We teach pattern making in Chinatown in Chinese. But we don't do it for our own students in the institution. And it's serious, but it's not just at FIT. It's all over this country. We're very bad at that. Maybe it's because we don't use it anymore.
Well, it has become so apparent that almost all the designers, except perhaps the handful of the most expensive designers, as designers of expensive merchandise. But almost all of them spend a great deal of time in the Orient as part of their jobs.
For production.
Right, yes.
What's going to happen when the technology is such that you're not really searching for the cheap labor anymore?
Well, that will be a good day, won't it? I mean, it will be a day that I'm sure the American market will be happy to see come.
It's almost here. What we are discovering, though, I discovered something just this year that while we're still talking about catching up in technology, the Japanese, through something called the CCC, creativity, communication, something or other, are back into design. The most exciting designs that I have seen in 14 years at the Fashion Institute were here last month from Japan. And this came out of the Kyoto. And the Japanese have already recognized once again that it's going to be the design that's going to make the difference. And not just running around searching for cheap labor. That's going to change very, very quickly. Do you know about the Draper Lab project?
Which project?
Draper Labs.
No, I don't think so.
The apparel industry, along with the Amalgamated Union, I think it was Arrow Shirt and a few other companies, commissioned the Draper Labs to determine once and for all whether a robot would be able to actually cut and sew. And they deliberately went to Draper Labs, and they deliberately kept any one of us in the education of fashion education out of this completely. And they went to the same people who gave us the aerospace and the defense contracts and gave them the assignment. I actually saw a robot make a sleeve 6 months ago. And I can tell you now it's possible.
And so they're programmed to do a particular thing.
Yep, I saw them make a sleeve. If they make a sleeve, they can make a collar. If they make a collar, they can attach it to a bodice. And I watched it. It's called the tailored. It did with tailored garments. But the fact is that it is technically possible to have robots handle soft goods. That was the question. The answer is yes. So with the Gerber Scientific, the work that they're doing in the CAMSCOs and in the CAD/CAM systems and with Electra and its vesture, it's just a matter of time.
Could you talk a little bit more about the master's programs of which you are offering, I think, 2 this fall?
Yes.
Which you're going to, and what will you add to these, and what is your time frame?
Well, in the first place, we set out more than a dozen years ago to create a university of the fashion industries based on the land-grant college, the Morrill Act, which created the first colleges in the world that were concerned with the education of working people. So we've been on the deliberate plan to create an urban version of the land-grant college, but based on a community college model. The community, of course, not being geographic, but being an industry. And our first moves was to, first of all, protect the integrity of the 2-year associate degree program, and we wrote that into the legislation, and then to create our 10 baccalaureate programs and get some experience in upper division education. We applied to the state legislature, into state university, into the state ed department. It's taken us about 5 years for the authority to go into graduate education, which would then give us the entire model. And they've approved now our first of all, they've given us the authority to go into graduate education, so the Fashion Institute may now offer a Master of Arts degree. The question, the political question and the educational question, but mostly political, is what master degree programs will we provide? And the concerns are that we would be in direct competition with the independent sector, and in fact would be harmful to the independent sector, even though we'd be the only public institution offering these programs. The first 2 that have are now, they've been approved by the state university, and they'll be under review at the state ed department next month, are both in museum studies. One is in restoration, the other is in museum gallery management. The needs are quite great in those areas. We wanted to add the third at the same time, which is gallery art administration. Art is big business in New York City, and the ability to manage a gallery, open a gallery, display an exhibit, price objects, the cooler virtues of the business side of art isn't offered anywhere. and we wanted to move into that, but we began with the 2 museum programs because we could identify the placements and the needs were so great. Remember, these were jobs that heretofore been handled by volunteers who just won't volunteer anymore, and they want professional status. The third area we're moving into is going to be the Master of Management Arts. That is based on a recognition that the typical MBA candidate who now manages most of American businesses probably served most businesses well. They take certain science, the science of management, but then they major in finance or marketing or personnel or that sort of thing. We've come to feel that a good number of the fashion industries require product knowledge. They require the same understanding that the original entrepreneur of the industry brought in creating the company in the first place. And bringing in a bright young Wharton School manager without product knowledge doesn't meet the needs of all the industries. So we want to carve out just one part of it, not too large numbers, but we just know that there is a need for management who has as much knowledge of product as the original entrepreneur. So, and rather than call it an MBA, we filed for an MMA, which is a Master of Arts, but that's a political problem. The other area, the final one we're going to go into, is a program which we call the Master Artisan. We've come to recognize that the strength of our nation has always been the technical skills of our people. Despite the songs we used to sing as children, we've never been really blessed with that many natural resources. We've really had our technical skills. It was our proudest product, our biggest export. And we've lost that edge. We've lost that edge of the technology to countries with even less resources than we have, and we have to reclaim it. And reclaiming the skills and productivity of the American people is very high in the agenda. We think it should be high on the agenda of American policy, but it isn't. So what we did is we looked at the old London Guild certification programs many, many years ago. The London Guilds provided a mark of artisanship, and when you had that mark and you stamped it on an item, you knew it was the best. And we thought we could demonstrate a return to master artisanship by going into certain areas of printmaking and jewelry design and have a master artisans program pretty much based on that London Guild's model. And hopefully other colleges and universities will follow suit and go into other fields because we think that's terribly important. So the Master Artisans, the Master of Management Arts, the Retail Gallery Art Administration, Museum Studies and Restoration, Preservation. We're talking about preservation, restoration, conservation. Our country's getting older. And all these are exciting fields with many, many good job opportunities.
What about the job opportunities in sales? Are you addressing yourself at all, or in which part of the program?
Well, we're calling it marketing. I think that in my tenure as president of the Fashion Institute in the next decade, the key is going to be marketing. And that's where we're putting most of our emphasis in our business side of the institution, our upper division programs in marketing. And after all, whether it's advertising or packaging or merchandising, we're really talking about marketing, creating new products, finding new consumers, moving goods. That's really the strength of this institution.
Now that's on the graduate level. What about undergraduate?
That's on the undergraduate level. That's on the baccalaureate programs. All of our baccalaureate programs, not all of them, those in the fashion buying and merchandising programs are moving to marketing. The other two areas, the textile engineering and the apparel production, are still two major needs. One of the great ironies of this institution, if you added up all the people studying apparel production in America, we're larger than all of them combined, and yet we're terribly short of enough graduates to service the industry. It's one of the problems the industries are facing. We can barely get production people through this institution before they're gobbled up, and we can't get them into Pennsylvania, we can't get them into New Jersey, in North Carolina, everywhere you go. I don't know what the problem is anymore. I used to know. Most of the students who come to us because their families are in the business, or they know somebody else who's in the business, or they see it as a freshman in this institution and transfer into the BS degree programs in apparel production. But somehow it's noble to go into hard goods, industrial engineering, and somehow it's degrading, or I don't know what the problem is, because I don't know of a single graduate of this institution in apparel production that doesn't start out at least 17, 18,000 a year, make 30, 40, 50,000 within the first 5 years. I don't understand it.
Perhaps one of the needs in the institution is related to that. Perhaps one of the needs is for far more extensive description of industry and industry opportunities.
You know, we've tried that. We've offered free scholarships. We've had posters. We had brochures. We even had films made. We've even invited to this institution to send our people out to every high school in the greater New York area. We've had counseling sessions. There just isn't. I thought I had the answers years ago. The longer I stay here, we're not worried about it any longer because we're getting, in terms of the amount of space that we have.
Oh, actually,
But they're coming from Canada.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suggest that your student population needs to be reached out for. I'm suggesting that when it's here, the student population perhaps needs a little more exposure to the notion that you can earn a great deal of money in production.
Yes, well, we
That
do.
may not have the glamour of design, but it
That's
has.
true. We do have now crossover majors. This is our second year, where students may go from fashion buying and merchandising to apparel production, or from fashion design to apparel production, or from textiles and so on. So those crossover majors are somewhat successful. We're picking up 60, 70 kids a year who do that kind of crossover, but it's far less than what the industries need.
Yeah. Well, it seems to parallel then the crossover in industry itself, where retailers go into manufacturing. Not usually the reverse, but retailers have been going into manufacturing, where their skills apparently are very useful too.
That's so they could have their 200% markup instead of 100% markup. Those are called hostile imports.
I think I am coming to the end of my questions, although I am sure there is a lot more that we should be talking about. I will cut that line out of the tape, but I have a feeling that I'm missing some things, and I'm not sure what they are. It is interesting, though. I would like to know, how much of a role is the union taking in the council these days? On your board, for example, you have a lot of manufacturers.
Well, Chick Shaking is a member of my board. He's president of
Yes,
ILGW,
right.
and I had dinner last week with Jay Mazur and Shelley. The union has.
Shelley Appleton, whom I'm going to interview, I think.
Shelley's in the hospital. He'll be getting out, we hope, this weekend. In fact, I just talked to him this morning. I find the union a little negative nowadays. I'm sure, I'm speaking to ILGW, that's the one that we're closest with.
Right.
These are very decent people, and of course have pioneered some of social action in this country. But they're. I don't think that the unions will ever be back at their 400,000 membership in the glory days of the ILG. I think it's going to be a leaner, meaner organization, a lot different. They have been extremely cooperative in the technology. I was worried, for example, when I ordered the original Camscos, I thought they would really give me a bad time because none of the union shops had the computer grading and that capability. They quickly understood that we have to be concerned about kids working in the year 2050 and giving great support. They're not as negative as I thought they'd be, although they're somewhat depressed. I see maybe it's because I'm the president of Fashion Institute and I have to be, but I don't think that's really true. I'm not that naive. They're much more negative about the future of this industry generally than we are. I just see it as being a much more diversified industry. And when I look at the people who are coming into it and want to go into it, it's a different ballgame. When I deal with the younger managers, of course, we're great friends with David Schwartz and Freddie Pomerantz and Abe Schrader and all those, but we're also working with their children, with their sons,
Sure.
and Mort and Johnny and Richard. They're a little bit more optimistic, and
Yes.
I think that that's the side I'd rather be on. To answer your question, though, the ILG is going through its changes. I don't think it's been doing a hell of a lot of organizing.
I don't think, as an international union, I don't know what they've been doing in California, and I don't know quite what's happening in Chinatown, although I know they're working. I think it's a good future for the union. As a matter of fact, if I were a young man looking for a career, I wouldn't hesitate at all going to the ILG. It's going to have a whole different look to it. It's going to be much different. Remember that the industry that the ILG represents has been somewhat transient, people coming and going. There are a lot of terrible federal laws that cause enormous constraint in terms of trust taxes of people who are really itinerant workers. They're really casual workers. They're not workers who are making a career out of it. And this causes a lot of difficulty of if I own a business and want to sell it, and I certain trust funds that I have to control. And I don't want to buy a business where I have an obligation down the line which may or may not ever occur. There's a lot of this confusion in legislation that needs a lot of help. But I think the ILG and the amalgamated are going to end up with a different cadre of worker. They're going to be highly skilled technologists, and they're going to be career people. They're not going to be the casual workers who come in the season and go out. And it's going to have a different look to it. And I think the entire trade union movement it's just not in the apparel industries, but in all industries, they're going to have to take another look at their purpose and their mission. Much of the contracts that are now being negotiated require retraining as a quid pro quo of introduction of technology. So there's going to be an enormous retraining effort undertaken. Some institutes, we're not going to get into that too much, but there'll be quite a job for a lot of community colleges and technical institutes. And we're going to come out of it in the middle of the year 2074 with a whole different format. And I think it's as positive as you'll get anywhere. We've been spending the last 20 years, we're not looking for cheap labor. I remember in my first year at the Fashion Institute, we went to Puerto Rico to help the lingerie industry create a capability of production on a 10-year tax abatement. 10 years later, now they were asking us to go to Haiti. They have to stop this nonsense. You can't keep running around the world. There's too much revolution. The people want a better shape. It's coming to an end. We're in an era of shared power. People are going to want to have a certain quality of life, and running around just... American industry is always looking at the 1 year, bottom line, P&L statement, stockholder bonus. We're not taking long enough views, and we have to come around and start thinking a little bit the way particularly the Japanese, or at least take a 10-year view.
Right. When you said that you have a pretty firm idea of where you'll be 5 years down the road and 8 years down the road and 10, could you elaborate a little bit? Where do you
Sure. We spend, we do this every 5 years. Last year we went off on a 5-day retreat. First of all, we carefully monitor the demographics of education. We knew 8 years ago that there would be a change in the number of 17 to 24-year-olds. I mean, we have it well plotted. We know our markets pretty well. We know our market share pretty well. We not only project the consumer. One of the reasons we went into a weekend college, we have a weekend college for women here.
Right.
We don't say it's for women, but it is for women. We saw in our early research that the growing market in higher education, this was 8 years ago, was going to be women, and women returning to the work world, so we translate that into program. We have on the shelves right now majors that we could move on in 24 hours, giftware, toy design.
If you had the room.
If we had the room. So we're constantly looking at not only what we teach, but what the needs will be. We were the first institution in America in print about the entrepreneur and small businesses. We were the first institution in America that had a center for small business. We were the first people to publicize the MIT study that 80% of all new jobs are created by companies with 20 employees and less. We did this in 72, 73. People are starting to catch up with it. We are also looking at branch campuses. We have contracts now with the major universities all over the country for junior year in New York. So we have a lot of fallback positions, a lot of strategic planning we put into place. Every one of our majors at the college are under 5-year reviews now. Where are we now? Where we want to go? And in each of the majors, the changes are somewhat enormous in display and exhibit. In display,
Well, that's changed to visual merchandising, and we don't worry about window trimming and point of sales. We're really talking about lighting, and we're talking about how the total environment of moving goods. And all of our majors in textiles have to be as accurate in computer design as they are in weaving, in just all aspects of the curriculum. So we're never standing still at the Fashion Institute, and our planning is serious. We don't go into planning to plan. We go into planning in order to bring about organizational change. And so we're constantly changing this organization.
Have you got any plans for, when you mention traveling shows, or have you had any plans for having traveling shows of some of those great exhibits you've had?
In each exhibit that we do, for example, the Napoleonic silks, the one that we're doing now on we just got a marvelous grant from Arrow Shirt. We're going to be doing sports, American sportswear. We build into all those proposals an opportunity to move the shows. It depends on the sponsor. We're responsible. We're a public institution, so the exhibits that we have here and the shows that we have here, and the thousands people who come here, of course, serve our students and the institution. But we provide that opportunity to any of the people who support these programs, so we'll take it anywhere. And we've had the lingerie show. Went to Japan and went to France. The answer is yes. It's built into the budget. And what normally what the grand tours do is, well, we'll look at the show, and then we'll see.
But this is not a fundraising device for you?
Oh, no. None of these shows, for example, the 100 Years of Playbill and all that, we don't make money on that. Its purpose is educational. And
so if you were to travel a show like that to 5 or 6 places in the country, you would not, I assume you would not do it except under a grant.
Of course, and then have to be cost.
Sure,
cost.
right.
But we don't do it. We don't do this fundraising. We really we're a state university, and we're not a proprietary school. We could make a lot. We don't even charge to go into the museum or into our gallery.
Right.
We don't even ask for a donation. Although that's constantly in review.
Right. And when you mention satellites, of course, there are lots of, just as hospitals are having to rethink all of their plans in their strategic planning, a lot of them are building satellites because they are, they need the certificate of need from their states and they can't get them. So in order to raise funds, they are, in many cases, beginning to do other things like...
Well, what's in trouble are traditional institutions doing traditional things. Institutions that open after Labor Day and close right after Christmas and go from 9 to 3, 9 to 4, 9 months a year. I mean, offering traditional programs. They're in a lot of trouble. The average age of a community college student in New York State is over 30. So we're dealing with different populations now. And the whole trend is in a much different direction. We even have a bizarre plan. It's not so bizarre if you think about it. A midnight college, if we had to. A lot of people would go to school from midnight till 3 in the morning. If I didn't have a custodial problem, I probably would have started a long time ago. But as long as you think of marketing, it goes back to marketing.
Yes, that it does.
Everything is really marketing. I discovered, for example, our most popular program is fashion buying and merchandising. In fact, we admit about 1 out of 8 applicants. In that program alone, and we only have 30% market share. So we have a lot of growth. There isn't really... we don't really concern ourselves here with the demographic problems that other institutions face because of the flexibility of the institution. We could just do anything we really wanted to do as we see downturn. The reason we were able to do that is because we monitor our placement so carefully. I have to report to my board at the October board meeting, October 15th meeting, the placement statistics, not only of the graduating class, but the year follow-up and the 3-year studies. So we monitor very carefully what's happening to our graduates. And,
how far back, how many years does that go back, do you know?
As long as I've been here.
Yes.
And even before that, I think. I think Eleanor Freed, who was our original placement director.
Right. I'll be talking to her.
Eleanor put into place some very interesting programs. First of all, giving faculty rank to admissions to placement counselors. which then allowed me to put them on curriculum committees and
Right.
academic standards committees and mission committees. So they're part of faculty, and they're able to report back to the faculty the performance of the program. So we closed the loop, and they can do this in so many informal, much less formal ways, where people quickly know we're not into hand this, we better get into hand this, or Marvin, we need another program in pattern making for February, and we move into pattern making for February. But I keep getting that feedback, and Eleanor is the one that put that into place, and I think we owe a lot to her because this institution is taking it very seriously. One of the first things we did when I first arrived, when we went into this massive building program, was increase the placement numbers of placement constants so we can cover all the departments.
Do you have any plans now for new building?
Yes, we're right here.
Ah.
A dormitory. But it'll be a multi-purpose. We're going to have 4 floors of classroom space and about 18 stories for dormitories.
Where will that be?
It's going to be right on the lot between the Resource Center and Nader Hall, where the Iron Fashion is.
Right.
I hope to get the financing in place in the next 30 days. But it's very elusive. It's very, very elusive because of bond marketing and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But we're desperate. I have 120 kids to 200 kids a year can't come back to their own college.
Right.
And the living conditions in the dormitories are obscene. 4 kids in a room, it's really bad. And then there's a lottery at the end of the first year to stay on in the dorms. The housing in New York City is just impossible. Even the kids who could afford anything can't find it because landlords don't want to rent to students anyway. So we have to do the dorm. And that's the hardest money to raise. There's nothing more difficult to raise than capital dollars. If people want to give scholarships. And that's the way it should be. It should be hard. I've been working on this for 3 years.
Yeah. Well, I hope you get there very fast.
We will.
Yeah.
I'm sure by next year we'll have the ground broken and the dorm up, or at least started. It'll take a couple of years to get it up. And then once we get we're desperately short of classroom space.
Yes.
But once we have classroom space, we can start. We want to go into restoration. Want to go into even antique restoration. You know, our country's getting older.
Yes.
And there's
Right.
Gosh, there's so many things to do.
It's exciting, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I wrote a paper some years ago called "Plenty of Work, Not Enough Jobs," and it seems that we're always in all free societies. God knows there's so much work to be done, and so many things that ought to be done. There's never enough jobs to go around, and that seems to be the major fear of. That's why there's so few democracies left in the world, because in a free society there's always the nagging fear there's not enough jobs to go around. But if you step back and you look at the work that has to get done and then translate that into jobs, and it seems to be plenty of jobs around. But we're under some misconception that the role of institutions such as the Fashion Institute is to find out what industry needs and train the people for their needs rather than look at the people's needs and educate the people for what they need. And I think it's a significant difference. When you train people to do work instead of get a job, there's a profound difference in how you approach educational tasks. And therein is the difference. So many of our students are self-employed. And we at the alumni party, we had an alumni party the other night, and I was talking to half a dozen students who graduated from the college over the last 8 years. And 4 of them, since the day they walked out of here, have been self-employed, working out of the freelance bureau on 42nd Street in advertising design, making enormous money. I told them I was getting a little worried about them because they're getting a little older and they're not into Blue Cross Blue Shield and all those goodies that we worry about. And they laughed. They have a different agenda, and they're controlling their lives a lot differently. When I went around talking to the kids, they were all making at least $2,000 a week. But they worked when they wanted to, and they were living a lifestyle that made me nervous as a depression baby. But they had a different agenda, and they weren't about to go to the corporate world ever. And that's a very interesting phenomenon, I think. And it's the first time since the Civil War that we've had that kind of attitude. I also ran into 4 or 5 textile design graduates living in Soho, selling samples. I said, what are you doing? Then they hire some high school kids to do their coloring, or colorists, whatever they are. And that's the lifestyle that they wanted. And then I met a young lady who just opened up a store in the mall in New Jersey, some specialty shop, making less than she was earning when she was with B. Altman, but controlling her own business.
Yeah, right.
That seems to be another interesting
Yeah.
phenomenon.
I think it's. I think there's a relationship between what you're saying now and what Andrew Goodman used to say, which was that at some point in the future there were going to be two kinds of stores. One of which would be a Kmart kind of discount store with no services or amenities whatsoever, and on the other hand, a Bergdorf Goodman. And I think it's not impossible that that can be related to what you're talking about, because I think there will be that kind of in business on my own. But on the other hand, there is a great need among large companies in this industry, which by merger and acquisition have become giants, and where the family management will not exist in one more generation. And those people, their replacements have to be trained too, and I think those are the two ends of the spectrum, maybe. Anyway, what I would like to do is end right here for the moment